My mother-in-law is borderline crazy and I need help. You see, I've been married to Brian for a year now. Our families have known each other for a long time and have always been close. So it felt natural when our parents suggested that we might be a good match for each other. We both come from similar religious backgrounds, which made it easier for us to connect. Our shared values gave us a good foundation to build our relationship. Before me, Brian had a serious relationship with a woman named Vivian. They were really close, and it seemed like things were getting pretty serious between them. However, there was one major issue. Their families didn't get along. While Brian's parents adored Vivian and wanted her to become a part of the family as quickly as possible, Vivian's parents didn't feel the same way about Brian's family. They thought Brian's family were too strict and religious, which created a huge conflict. In the end, Vivian's parents didn't approve of her marrying Brian and put a lot of pressure on her to end the relationship. I'm not entirely sure why Vivian decided to listen to her parents, but eventually she broke things off, telling Brian that she couldn't see a future with him. It really hurt Brian, and he took it hard for a long time. But after some time, he understood the situation and managed to move on. 2 years later, we met, and things started to fall into place. From the very beginning, Brian was really open and honest with me about his past relationship with Vivian. He told me about the breakup and explained that the main reason for their split was the clash between their families. He also warned me about his mom, saying that she could be a bit too much at times. He mentioned that despite all the boundaries he had tried to set with her, she often overstepped them. Honestly, none of this bothered me much. Since his mother was already a family friend of my mom's, I thought maybe it wouldn't be as big of a deal as he was making it out to be. I had seen his mom around over the years, and she always seemed pretty manageable to me. However, it wasn't until I got engaged to Brian that I really began to notice a different side to his mom. Since we were planning to get married, Brian suggested that I move in with him. At first, everything seemed fine, but one morning after I had just finished a shower, I walked into the kitchen to find his mom casually going through our fridge like it was her own. I was completely taken aback. I asked her what she was doing. She casually told me that she had a key to the apartment and sometimes came over to fill up the fridge. It felt so strange and invasive to me. I politely told her that now that I was living here too, I would really appreciate it if she could give me a heads up before just showing up unannounced. Her face tightened and she looked upset, but she didn't say anything in response. I thought maybe she got the message. But the very next week, I came home for lunch to find her rummaging through my closet. At first, I honestly thought someone had broken into the house and I was ready to call the police. But when I realized it was just her, I was absolutely livid. I screamed at her, asking what on earth she was doing in our home again. She responded nonchalantly, saying that she was just looking through my closet to see if there was any dirty laundry she could wash for me. That really crossed the line. I told her very firmly that I was an adult. I could take care of my own laundry, so there was no reason for her to be going through my personal things. I made it clear that this was completely unacceptable. That same day, I had a serious talk with Brian about what had happened, and he was just as shocked as I was. He didn't hesitate for a second. He immediately called his mom and told her she needed to return the key to our place. He was pretty upset, and honestly, he was really blunt with her, even yelling at her for going through our personal things without permission. It was an uncomfortable and awkward moment, but I appreciated how he had my back. At least I felt like he was standing up for me, and I hoped that this would set some boundaries with his mom moving forward. I ended up telling my parents about it, and they were just as surprised. They couldn't believe that his mom was acting like that, but in the end, mother-in-law did return the key and apologize to me, so we decided to let the whole situation go and move on. Things felt a little more peaceful after that, though it did leave me with an unsettled feeling, wondering if she would try something like that again. Then, just a few months before our wedding, something unexpected happened. Vivian, Brian's ex, sent him a message on Facebook. She basically told him how much she regretted leaving him and admitted that hearing he was with someone else had made her think about trying again. She even said she wanted to give their relationship one last try. When Brian showed me the message, we both kind of laughed at it. I wasn't upset, just amused at how out of the blue it was. Brian didn't waste any time and didn't respond to her at all. He just blocked her immediately, and I thought that was the right move. Later, Brian casually mentioned the situation to his mom, and she got kind of upset. She said Brian should have had the decency to at least talk to Vivian when she reached out. But Brian didn't back down. He told her he had nothing left to say to Vivian and that she was a thing of the past. Mother-in-law seemed a little taken aback by his response, but she didn't press him any further. It felt like another reminder of how boundaries needed to be set with her, even if she didn't always agree with them. Then came the wedding, and things got even more complicated with my mother-in-law. She insisted that Brian invite Vivian, his ex, to the wedding. Brian immediately told her that he didn't want to see his ex at our wedding. This was about us, not about her. But my mother-in-law didn't back down. She argued that it was only right to have Vivian there because she had been such an important part of Brian's life for so many years. According to her, without Vivian, the whole thing just wouldn't feel right. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Not feel right? Vivian was his ex for a reason. Why on earth did she even need to be at our wedding? I was shocked, but I was relieved when Brian stood firm and told her no, he wasn't going to invite Vivian, and that was final. On the day of our wedding, things got even more awkward with my mother-in-law. She showed up in a lilac gown that was almost white, something that felt like an attempt to upstage me. At first, I was really thrown off by it, but I decided it wasn't worth making a scene over. I just ignored her and focused on having a great day with Brian. Thankfully, the rest of the wedding went smoothly and we had a wonderful time. Now, it's been a year since Brian and I got married, and things are good between us. We're happy together. But there's still one ongoing issue: my mother-in-law. For some strange reason, she's still completely fixated on Brian's ex. Even after our marriage, she continues to bring Vivian up in conversations, and it's starting to get under my skin. Out of nowhere, during family dinners, she'll casually ask Brian if he ever thinks about Vivian and wonders how his life would have turned out if she had stayed with him. Brian always gives her a weird look, and I can feel myself glaring at her from across the table, but she acts like it's the most normal question in the world, completely unaware of how inappropriate and uncomfortable it is. It's like she just can't let go of the past, and every time she brings it up, it makes things feel strained. Over time, I've noticed more and more that my mother-in-law is constantly bringing up Vivian, especially when it comes to things like food. Whenever I cook, she can't help but make comments about how much she misses Vivian's cooking, saying it was so much better than mine. At first, I thought maybe it was just a random comment, but it kept happening and it started to feel really uncomfortable. It wasn't just about food, though. One time when we were talking about children and people were asking me and Brian when we were going to try for kids, my mother-in-law suddenly interrupted the conversation and said that if Brian had married Vivian, they would have had beautiful skinned children. I was shocked. It was such a strange, unsolicited comment, and it left both Brian and me feeling uneasy. Her comments were never subtle, and every time she brought up Vivian, it felt like a subtle dig at me. Brian and I really don't understand why she keeps bringing up his ex. He's asked her multiple times to stop mentioning Vivian, but her response is always the same. She didn't mean anything serious by it. And as his mother, it's her right to wonder what could have been. It's frustrating because she seems to dismiss how uncomfortable it makes both of us. She also has this habit of mentioning how Vivian was always her first choice for him and how he just settled for me. It feels like a constant reminder that I'm not good enough, and it's hard not to take it personally. The recent incident with the food, though, really pushed me to my limit. My mother-in-law has this habit of bringing over meals for Brian because, according to her, my cooking is unfit for her son. She constantly tells him how she's doing him a favor by bringing over meals because she believes I'm not a good cook, even though Brian has never once complained about my food. I honestly don't mind her bringing food over. It's one less thing for me to worry about. But the real issue is that after eating her meals, Brian has started commenting that the food tastes so much like what Vivian used to cook. And if he ever asks my mother-in-law about it, she tells him that she's been trying to replicate Vivian's cooking because she was such a good cook. I can't even put into words how hurtful that is. It feels like a constant reminder that no matter what I do, I'm being compared to someone else. And what's worse is that my mother-in-law seems to enjoy this little game, constantly reminding Brian of his past with Vivian, even though he's moved on and married me. It's been wearing on me, and it feels like the last straw in dealing with her behavior. With our anniversary coming up, I wanted to do something special for Brian. I thought it would be a nice gesture to cook him a great meal, especially since he loves mother-in-law's dishes. I figured the best way to learn would be to have her teach me how to make it. So I invited her over and she agreed to help me out. Brian was out for his golf lessons that morning, so it was just me and my mother-in-law in the kitchen. We were chatting while she taught me how to make the dish. But there was something off that I noticed during the cooking session. Throughout the entire time, she kept her phone in her hand, constantly texting someone. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just a habit. But then she went to the washroom and left her phone on the kitchen counter. As I continued to cook, I heard her phone ding a few times with incoming messages. Curiosity got the better of me and I glanced at her phone. When I saw who she was texting, my heart sank. It was Vivian. She was giving my mother-in-law instructions on how to cook the meal that we were making, along with advice on what ingredients to use. This is when I realized that mother-in-law had been texting Vivian throughout the entire cooking session, asking her questions about the recipe. I couldn't believe what I was seeing and I froze in shock. When my mother-in-law came back from the washroom, I confronted her right away. I asked her why she was texting Vivian and if Brian knew about this. Her face went pale and she immediately snatched the phone out of my hands, clearly flustered. She told me I had no right to go through her phone. I didn't back down though. I continued to press her on why she was still in contact with Vivian, especially after everything that had happened. I could feel the tension building and it was hard to keep my composure, but I wasn't going to let this slide. It felt like a huge betrayal, especially since she had agreed to help me learn, and yet she was still so tied up with Vivian behind my back. Mother-in-law refused to admit that she was getting cooking instructions from Vivian. But I told her there was no point in lying, since I had already seen their messages. After a lot of back and forth, she finally cracked and admitted that she had been in touch with Vivian all along. She tried to brush it off, saying it wasn't a crime to talk to Brian's ex and that it wasn't a big deal. I could tell she was getting defensive and trying to make it seem like it was no big deal, but I knew something wasn't right. She tried to explain that she had just been double checking the ingredients with Vivian to make sure everything was right. I pointed out that she had been cooking this exact meal every week and bringing it to our house for months. Why would she need Vivian's help for something she had been making regularly? That's when her face turned a bit red and she finally admitted the truth. She confessed that the meals she had been bringing over weren't actually cooked by her. They were cooked by Vivian. I was absolutely stunned. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Brian's ex had been cooking meals for him all this time and I had no idea. I had always been under the impression that my mother-in-law was the one preparing them. And here she was admitting that she'd been sending over his ex's cooking all along. Mother-in-law tried to justify herself by saying it didn't really matter in the end who cooked the meals as long as Brian was getting healthy food. She also pointed out how happy she was that I was finally inspired to learn Brian's favorite meal, and that she was happy to teach me, just like Vivian had cooked for him, so he could continue having good food every day. At that point, I could feel my anger boiling up. How could she do this? She had been bringing these meals over, making it seem like she was doing something special for her son, when in reality she had been outsourcing it all to Vivian. It hit me like a ton of bricks. Brian had always mentioned how familiar the meals tasted, and now I understood why. I was beyond furious at that point, with all the frustration and anger building up inside me. Without thinking, I grabbed the entire cauldron of gravy that my mother-in-law had just helped me prepare and threw it straight into the bin. It felt like the only thing that could express how I was feeling in that moment. And then I yelled at her to get out of my house, to leave, and that I didn't want to see her face anymore. She tried to argue that I was overreacting and that I had no right to ask her to leave. She argued that Vivian always knew Brian's food tastes better than I did. So instead of feeling bitter about it, I should just learn and be more like her. I was seething, but I took a deep breath and counted to 10 in my mind. I looked her in the eyes and asked her again, and this time in a calm but firm voice, to leave before I did something I would regret. Finally, mother-in-law left, grumbling all the way out. I felt like a weight had been lifted, but I was also shaken by what had just happened. Later, when Brian came back home, I told him everything, laid it all out, and he was just as shocked as I was. He couldn't believe his mom had been doing this behind our backs for so long. He tried to call mother-in-law to confront her, but she's so terrified now that she's refused to pick up his calls. She knows that I've told Brian everything, and she's tried to text me saying that I'm an a-hole for exposing her. According to her, what she's been doing is completely acceptable, and I'm just making it a bigger deal than it is. It's exhausting. And I feel like I'm the one who's been made to look like the villain when I've just been trying to protect my relationship and set healthy boundaries. It's infuriating to me that she still doesn't see how wrong this is. She's so trapped in her own way of thinking that she's refusing to acknowledge how hurtful and deceptive her actions have been. Instead of taking responsibility, she's trying to twist the situation and make it seem like I'm the problem. So Reddit, AITA, for being pissed that my mother-in-law has been making my husband's ex cook for him all this while. Update 1. To answer a few of your questions, I honestly can't wrap my head around why Vivian would even agree to cook for my mother-in-law. Whether she's doing it out of the goodness of her heart or if my mother-in-law is paying her, I don't know. But what really bugs me is that regardless of the reasons, she must know that the food she's making is ultimately for Brian. The whole thing just feels like some sort of scheme between them, and the fact that they've been playing me all this time is infuriating. They both must have known what they were doing, and it Pisses me off that they've been pretending all this time that everything was fine while secretly pulling the strings behind my back. Brian is absolutely furious. He can't believe his own mother would do something like this. He was so angry that he threw away all of the food she had brought over, saying that we're not taking any more of her meals. He told me that he never wants her to give us anything again, and honestly, I can't even blame him for his anger. It's got to feel like a total betrayal. Imagine finding out that your own mother, the person who's supposed to be on your side, has been working behind your back like this. It has to hurt. And while I'm mad at mother-in-law, I do feel bad for Brian, because this situation is forcing him to confront just how far his own mother is willing to go to manipulate things. It's like he's been blindsided by someone he thought he could trust completely. Both of us are on the same page about confronting her face to face this weekend. We can't just let this go. She's been avoiding our calls because she knows she's in the wrong, and she's hoping that if she ignores it long enough, it'll all blow over. But we're not going to let that happen. We're planning to confront her head on, because she can't keep avoiding this forever. She needs to understand the consequences of what she's done. It's time for her to face the truth and stop hiding behind her cowardice. This is a boundary that can't be ignored anymore. Update 2. It's been a week since my last update. We finally confronted mother-in-law, and a lot of things came out during that conversation. It was honestly overwhelming, and I don't think either of us expected what she was going to say. First of all, mother-in-law did admit shamelessly that she had always secretly hoped that Vivian and Brian would eventually get back together. She even went as far as saying that she thought they had always been each other's first true love, and that's why she had always been so invested in their relationship. According to her, after Brian told her about the message Vivian had sent him on Facebook, apologizing and saying she regretted their breakup, mother-in-law had reached out to her, and that's when their secret communication started, something I never even suspected was happening. Mother-in-law went on to say that Vivian still has lingering feelings for Brian, and that's why she agreed to cook for him when mother-in-law asked her to. Vivian cooks the meals, and then mother-in-law goes to pick them up, and she brings the food to our house and pretends like she's the one who's been cooking it all along. Brian started to yell at her, but mother-in-law tried to defend herself by saying that she wasn't doing anything wrong, and that she was only doing this because of him. She claimed that I had ruined her attempt to bring true love together by exposing the whole thing to Brian. Mother-in-law kept going on about how the way to a man's heart is through his stomach, and how she was just trying to keep Vivian and Brian connected. It was like she was living in some kind of delusional fantasy, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It felt like she wasn't even seeing me as a partner in Brian's life, but rather just someone standing in the way of what she wanted for him. I also asked mother-in-law why she always brings up Vivian in front of me, and she begrudgingly admitted that even though she likes me, she has never really accepted me as her true daughter-in-law. In her own words, she has always used Vivian's name to make me feel inferior, to make me insecure so she could have some kind of control over me. I was honestly shocked to hear her say that so plainly. To think that she had been actively trying to manipulate my feelings like that, just so she could maintain some twisted sense of power, was mind-boggling. It was like she saw me as a rival to her own fantasy of what Brian's life should look like, and she was willing to do anything to keep me in a position where I felt less than. Brian was beyond livid when he found out how much hate his mother had been harboring for me. He couldn't believe how deep this went, how his own mother had been treating me this way. Interestingly, while mother-in-law was fully aware of everything, Brian's father-in-law, had no clue about what was going on. He seemed pretty blindsided by the whole situation. Still, when the truth came out, father-in-law ended up supporting mother-in-law instead of Brian. That was kind of a breaking point for Brian. He made it clear to both his parents that he was going low contact with them for the time being. He couldn't stand how mother-in-law had been undermining our marriage, and he needed space to process everything. It was heartbreaking to watch, but I fully understood why he needed to set that boundary. I think it's for the best that Brian and I stay away from them for a while. Update 3. For those wondering if we decided to reach out to Vivian and get her side of the story, we did. After everything blew up with mother-in-law, Brian and I talked about it and we decided it was important to hear from Vivian herself, especially since she had been such a big part of this whole mess. We reached out to her through my social media and gave her my number so she could call us. When she did, things were just as bad as we feared. She confirmed everything. She admitted that she had been cooking the meals for Brian all this time, just like mother-in-law had been saying. She said that mother-in-law had been giving her hope all this time, making her think that there was still a chance for her and Brian to get back together in the future. She acted like she had been influenced by mother-in-law's constant encouragement, which only added to the confusion. According to Vivian, mother-in-law had told her that as long as Vivian kept pursuing him, he would eventually find his way back to her. Brian didn't hold back in the conversation. He made it absolutely clear to Vivian that everything she had been told was a lie. He told her very firmly that he was happy with me and that she needed to accept that and move on. He also told her that she was making things harder by continuing to keep this hope alive, especially when it wasn't fair to anyone involved. Vivian, of course, tried to argue a little bit. At the end of the day, even though she is a grown woman, Vivian continued to tell us that she had become a pawn in mother-in-law's game, caught between wanting to make things right with Brian and mother-in-law's persistent manipulation. This obviously doesn't excuse her actions. It is still unsettling to know that she has been a part of all this and had let it drag on for so long. Brian was resolute, though. He told her that it was time for all of us to move forward and put this chapter behind us. After everything came to light, I also made sure to inform my parents. I didn't want to keep any more secrets, especially when it involved such a deeply personal issue. My mom was just as upset as I was. She actually had a conversation with my mother-in-law and she was furious with her for crossing all those boundaries. She couldn't believe how far mother-in-law had gone to try and control Brian's life, and she let her know that it wasn't acceptable. Both of our families now agree that mother-in-law's behavior is seriously messed up. It's weird and manipulative to go to such lengths to try and influence Brian's decisions, especially when she should be respecting his marriage and boundaries. It's just been such a betrayal of trust, and now it feels like all we can do is move forward without them being a part of our lives for a while. It's been about 4 months since our last update, and things have been going so well for us. Brian and I have some exciting news to share. We're expecting. Yes, I'm pregnant, and we couldn't be happier. It feels like such a huge step forward in our lives, and it's brought us even closer together. We're both over the moon about this new chapter, and it's been such a wonderful, peaceful time for us as a couple. As for the situation with our in-laws, we're still no contact with them. After everything that happened, we decided it was the best decision for our mental and emotional well-being. While it's been tough at times, we both agree that cutting them out was the right thing to do. Our relationship is thriving. And we're focused on the future, especially with the baby on the way. We've created a space where we can be happy and secure, just the two of us, and we're excited about everything ahead. Interestingly, Vivian hasn't reached out to us at all after that conversation. We've had no contact from her, which honestly doesn't surprise me. After all the drama and everything that was exposed, I think she knows her place by now. It's been a relief not to have to deal with any of that drama anymore. Stay tuned for more stories from our girl relationships.